All right, welcome back to another episode of Mike Reads. Today we'll be continuing in our series on Thomas Sowell's Discrimination and Disparities with Chapter 4, The World of Numbers. We're going to go ahead and break this up into two reads. We should be able to get it done in two reads. Today's read is going to be a little bit shorter than the next. So without further ado, The World of Numbers. When trying to understand economic and social disparities, statistics are often used both to convey the magnitude of those disparities and to try to establish their causes. To some, numbers may convey a sense of objective hard facts. But even when the numbers are correct, the words that describe what the numbers are measuring may be incorrect or misleading. These include such basic numbers as income, unemployment rates, and rates of arrest for violation of laws. Numbers may also be misleading, not because of any intrinsic defects in either the numbers themselves or in the words describing them, but because of implicit assumptions about the norms to which those numbers are being compared. Here, the seemingly invincible fallacy of assuming an even or random distribution of outcomes as something to expect, in the absence of such complicating causes as genes or discrimination, can make many statistics that show very disparate outcomes be seen as indicating something fundamentally wrong in the real world, rather than something fundamentally wrong with the assumptions behind the norms to which those outcomes are being compared. Neither logic nor empirical evidence provides a compelling reason for expecting either equal or random outcomes among individuals, groups, institutions, or nations. When used with an awareness of their pitfalls, statistics can be enormously valuable in testing competing hypotheses about disparate outcomes. But statistics may nevertheless be grossly misleading when they are distorted by errors of omission or errors of commission. Errors of omission. The mere omission of one crucial fact can turn accurate statistics into traps that lead to conclusions that would be demonstrably false if the full facts were known. This often happens in comparisons of different ethnic groups and different income classes, among other comparisons. Group disparities. During a long and heated campaign in politics and in the media during the early 21st century, claiming that there was rampant discrimination against black home mortgage loan applicants, data from various sources were cited repeatedly, showing that black applicants for the most desirable kind of mortgages were turned down substantially more often than white applicants for those same mortgages. In the year 2000, for example, data from the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights showed that 44.6% of black applicants were turned down for those mortgages, while only 22.3% of white applicants were turned down. These and similar statistics from other sources set off widespread denunciation of mortgage lenders and demands that the government do something to stop rampant racial discrimination in mortgage lending institutions. The very same report by the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, which showed that blacks were turned down for conventional mortgages at twice the rate for whites, contained other statistics showing that whites were turned down for those same mortgages at a rate nearly twice that for, quote, Asian Americans and Native Hawaiians, end quote. While the rejection rate for white applicants was 22.3%, the rejection rate for Asian Americans and Native Hawaiians was 12.4%. But such data seldom, if ever, saw the light of day in most newspapers or in most television news programs, for which the black-white difference was enough to convince those journalists that racial discrimination was the reason. This conclusion fit existing preconceptions, apparently eliminating a need to check whether it also fits the facts. This one crucial omission enabled the prevailing preconception to dominate discussions in politics, in the media, and in much of academia. One of the very few media outlets to even consider the alternative explanations for the statistical differences was the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, which showed that 52% of blacks had credit scores so low that they would qualify for only the less desirable subprime mortgages, as did 16% of whites. Accordingly, 49% of blacks in the data cited by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution ended up with subprime mortgages, as did 13% of whites and 10% of Asians. But such statistics, so damaging to the prevailing preconception that intergroup differences and outcomes showed racial discrimination in the sense of discrimination too, were almost never mentioned in most of the mass media. The omitted statistics would have undermined the prevailing preconceptions that white lenders were discriminating against black applicants. However, that preconception at least seemed plausible, even if it failed to stand up under closer scrutiny. But the idea that white lenders would also be discriminating against white applicants and in favor of Asian applicants lacked even plausibility. What was equally implausible was that black-owned banks were discriminating against black applicants. But in fact, black-owned banks turned down black applicants for home mortgage loans at a higher rate than did white-owned banks. Household income statistics. It is, unfortunately, not uncommon to omit statistics that are discordant with prevailing preconceptions. This has become a common practice in politics, in the media, and even in much of academia. Such errors of omission are not confined to mortgage loan issues, but are also common in many discussion of income statistics. Household income data, for example, are often used to indicate the magnitude of economic disparities in a society. But to say that the top 20% of households have X times as much income as the bottom 20% of households exaggerates the disparity between flesh and blood human beings, which can be quite different from disparities between income brackets. That is because, despite equal numbers of households in each 20%, there are far more people in the top 20% of households. Census data from 2002 showed that there were 40 million people in the bottom 20% of households and 69 million people in the top 20% of households. Such facts are usually omitted in statistics about disparities in incomes. No doubt people in the top quintile average higher incomes than people in the bottom quintile. But the fact that there were also 29 million more people in this top quintile exaggerates the disparity in incomes among people. Later data for 2015 from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics indicated that there were now over 36 million more people in the top quintile than in the bottom quintile. Moreover, the number of people earning income was 4 times as great in the top quintile as in the bottom quintile. That is yet another of the errors of omission, when the truth would undermine a prevailing preconception. There are not only different numbers of people per household at different income levels, there are also different numbers of people per household from one ethnic group to another, and different numbers of people per household from one time period to another. Omitting those differences when drawing conclusions can distort the meaning or implications of those statistics. As the Bureau of the Census pointed out more than half a century ago, the number of households has been increasing faster than the number of people. In short, American households tend to contain fewer people per household over time, a trend continuing into the 21st century. There are not only smaller families in later times, more individuals are financially able to live in their own individual households rather than live with relatives or roommates, or live as individual roomers or in boarding houses as average incomes rise from generation to generation. When income per person is rising over the same span of years when the average number of persons per household is declining, that can lead to statistics indicating that the average household income is falling, even if all individual incomes are rising. For example, if per capita income rises by 25% over some span of years, during which the average number of persons per household declines from 6 persons to 4 persons, then 4 people in the later period have as much income as 5 people had in the earlier period. But that is still less income than 6 people had in the earlier period, so average household income falls, statistically, even if income per person has risen by 25%. Household income statistics can be misleading in other ways. If two low-income people are sharing an apartment in order to make the cost of rent less burdensome to each, and if either or both has an increase in salary, that can lead to one tenant moving out to live alone in another apartment, and that in turn can lead to a fall in average household income. If, for example, each of the two tenants has an income of $20,000 a year, and later both reach an income of $30,000 a year, leading to each living in a separate apartment afterwards, that will mean a fall in household income for these individuals from $40,000 a year to $30,000 a year. There will now be two low-income households instead of one, and each household will be poorer than the one they replaced. Again, a rise in individual income can be reflected statistically as a fall in household income. Since most income is paid to individuals rather than to households, and individual always means one person, while household can mean any changeable number of persons, why would household income statistics be used so often instead of individual income statistics? Clearly, omitting individual income statistics and using household income statistics instead is less useful to someone seeking the truth about economic differences among human beings. But household income statistics can be very useful for someone promoting political or ideological crusades based on statistics that exaggerate income disparities among people. Time and turnover. Another factor often omitted or distorted in discussions of income disparities is the time dimension. People in the bottom 20% are often spoken of as the poor, and if the income in that quintile has not changed much over some span of years, it may be said that the income of the poor has stagnated. But the great majority of people initially in the bottom quintile do not stay there permanently. Most of the people in that bottom quintile initially are likely to be gone in later years, precisely because their incomes have not stagnated. And our concern is for the fate of flesh and blood human beings, not the fate of abstract statistical categories. A University of Michigan study that followed a given set of working Americans from 1975 to 1991 found that 95% of the people initially in the bottom 20% were no longer there at the end of that period. Moreover, 29% of those initially in the bottom quintile rose all the way to the top quintile, while only 5% still remained in the bottom 20%. Since 5% of 20% is 1%, only 1% of the total population sampled constituted the poor throughout the years studied. Statements about how the income of the poor fared during those years would apply only to that 1% of the people. Similar distortions of reality occur when the time dimension is ignored in discussing people in the upper income brackets, who are often also spoken of as if they were an enduring class of people, rather than transients in those brackets, just like the poor in lower brackets. Thus, a New York Times essay in 2017 referred to, quote, this favored fifth at the top of the income distribution, end quote, as having collected, quote, since 1979, end quote, a far greater amount of income than others. Considering how much turnover there was among people in different quintiles from 1975 to 1991, the implicit assumption that there were the same people in the top quintile over the even longer period from 1979 to 2017 is a staggering assumption. But of course, the very idea of turnover was omitted. Another of the relatively few statistical studies that followed a given set of Americans over a span of years found a reality very different from what is usually portrayed in the media, in politics, or in academia. Quote, at some point between the ages of 25 and 60, over 3/4 of the population will find themselves in the top 20% of the income distribution. End quote. For most Americans in other quintiles to envy or resent those in the top quintile would mean envying or resenting themselves, as they will be in later years. Calling people in particular income brackets the poor, or the rich, implicitly assumes that they are enduring residents in those brackets, when in fact most Americans do not stay in the same income quintile from one decade to the next. The turnover rate among people in the highest income brackets is even greater than that of the population in general. Fewer than half the people in the much-discussed top 1% in income in 1996 were still there in 2005. People initially in the top 100th of 1% had an even faster turnover, and those with the 400 highest incomes in the country turned over fastest of all. Crime statistics and arrest statistics. Some of the most gross distortions of reality through errors of omission have involved quite simple omissions. No one needs to be an expert on the complexities of statistics in order to see through many statistical fallacies, including those based on simple omissions. But it does require stopping to think about the numbers instead of being swept along by a combination of statistics and rhetoric. Statistics cited in support of claims that the police target blacks for arrests usually go no further than showing that the proportion of black people arrested greatly exceeds the roughly 13% of the American population who are black. If anyone were to use similar reasoning to claim that the National Basketball Association referees were racially biased because the proportion of fouls that referees call against black players in the NBA greatly exceeds 13%, anyone familiar with the NBA would immediately see the fallacy, because the proportion of black players in the NBA greatly exceeds the proportion of blacks in the American population. Moreover, since blacks are especially overrepresented among the star players in the NBA, the actual playing time of black players on the floor would be even more disproportionately higher, and it is the players on the floor who get cited for fouls more so than secondary players sitting on the bench. What would be relevant to testing the hypothesis that blacks are disproportionately targeted for arrest by the police, or disproportionately convicted and sentenced by courts, would be objective data on the proportion of particular violations of the law committed by blacks compared to the proportions of blacks arrested, convicted, and sentenced for those particular violations. Such objective data are not always easy to come by, since data reflecting actions by the police would hardly be considered valid as a test of whether the actions of police were warranted. However, there are some particular statistics that are both relevant and independent of the actions of the police. The most reliable and objective crime statistics are statistics on homicides, since a dead body can hardly be ignored, regardless of the race of the victim. For as long as homicide statistics have been kept in the United States, the proportion of homicide victims who are black has been some multiple of the proportion of blacks in the population. Moreover, the vast majority of those homicide victims whose killers have been found were killed by other blacks, just as most white homicide victims were killed by other whites. Since the homicide rate among blacks is some multiple of the homicide rate among whites, it is hardly surprising that the arrest rate of blacks for homicide is also some multiple of the rate of homicide arrests among whites. It has nothing to do with the proportion of blacks in the general population, and everything to do with the proportion of blacks among people who commit a particular crime. Another violation of the law that can be tested and quantified independently of the police is driving in excess of highway speed limits. A study by independent researchers of nearly 40,000 drivers on the New Jersey Turnpike using high-speed cameras and a radar gun, showed a higher proportion of black drivers than of white drivers who were speeding, especially at the higher speeds. This study, comparing the proportion of blacks stopped by state troopers for speeding with the proportion of blacks actually speeding, was not nearly as accepted or even mentioned either by the media or by politicians as other studies comparing the number of blacks stopped by state troopers for speeding and other violations with the proportion of blacks in the population. Yet again, the specific facts have been defeated by the implicit presumption that groups tend to be similar in what they do, so that large differences in outcomes are treated as surprising, if not sinister. But demographic differences alone are enough to lead to group differences in speeding violations, even aside from other social or cultural differences. Younger people are more prone to speeding, and groups with a younger median age have a higher proportion of their population in age brackets where speeding is more common. When different groups differ in median age by income, or in some cases by 2 decades or more, there was never any reason to expect different groups to have the same proportion of their respective population speeding, or to have the same outcomes in any number of other activities that are more common in some age brackets than in others. The omission of data on the proportion of blacks, or any other racial group, engaged in a given violation of law, as distinguished from the proportion of blacks or others in the population at large, is sufficient to let racial profiling charges prevail politically, despite their inconsistency with either logic or evidence. Some professional statisticians have refused to get involved in racial profiling issues. As a professor of criminology in North Carolina explained, quote, "Good statisticians were throwing up their hands and saying, 'This is one battle you'll never win. I don't want to be called a racist.'" End quote. Among the other consequences is that many law enforcement officials also see this as a politically unwinnable battle, and simply back off from vigorous law enforcement, the results of which could ruin their careers and their lives. The net result of the police backing off is often a rise in crime, of which law-abiding residents in black communities are the principal victims. Some people may think that they are being kind to blacks by going along with unsubstantiated claims of racial profiling by the police. But as distinguished black scholar Sterling A. Brown said long ago, quote, "Kindness can kill as well as cruelty, and it can never take the place of genuine respect." End quote. All right, that finishes that section. The next read in this chapter will be on the subsection Errors of Commission, and we should be able to finish the chapter in that read. So until the next time, this has been Mike, signing off.